Hey Econ students, this is Jacob Clifford. Welcome to the Macroeconomics Unit 2 summary. Now before we begin, make sure you've got the ultimate review packet. Stop every once in a while, fill out the key terms, do some of the practice questions that are in the packet. Fill that stuff out because it's definitely going to help you practice and learn the concepts. Keep in mind that this free video on YouTube isn't really free. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a lot of effort on my part to make sure I'm making these videos for you. Now if you like it, please get the packet. It's the best way of saying thank you so much, Mr. Clifford. This is awesome. And I'm telling you, the packet's going to help you do great in your class. If you've watched this video before and you're just here to review, you can click ahead by clicking on one of these buttons. Again, we're going to start off by talking about the idea of GDP, gross domestic product, and how do you measure the growth of the economy. Then we'll start talking about unemployment. Then we jump into what's inflation, and then I'm going to talk about some inflation calculations like the GDP deflator and the CPI. And finally, we'll talk about the causes of inflation. Economics is a social science. In the second unit, it's going to feel a lot like that. We're going to talk about a lot of concepts, talk about definitions. We're not doing very many graphs, but trust me, we're going to get into that stuff in units 3, 4, and 5. The concepts you learned in unit 1 are basically for both micro and macroeconomics. And so now the class is about to split. So now we're jumping fully into macroeconomics. Remember, macroeconomics is the study of the entire economy. Look at the big picture. Things like unemployment, inflation, how the government should get involved, or if the government should get involved in the economy. Now there's two reasons why people study the macroeconomy. First, it's to measure the health of the economy, to find out, is the economy getting better or is it getting worse? We have some problems ahead. And then the second reason is to fix it. So there's problems, let's fix them. What's fiscal policy, monetary policy? As we go through this course, you'll find out that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll start off with how do you measure the economy, and then we'll start talking about how do you fix the economy. Now, that being said, there are 3 goals of every economy. It doesn't matter if they're centrally planned or free market. 3 goals are, number 1, promote economic growth. Next, to limit unemployment. And last, to keep prices stable, to keep from having rampant, crazy inflation. Let's talk about the first goal, promoting economic growth. Now, the most important measure when it comes to growth is GDP, or gross domestic product. It's the dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. Now, keep in mind, it's the dollar value. It's measured in dollars, not in numbers of chickens and cars and nails produced. It's the value of all that stuff. It's also final goods, so it doesn't count intermediate goods, and it's in the country's border. So if an American owns a business in Japan and they're producing stuff that is bought and sold in Japan, that counts towards Japan's GDP. So it has to be produced in your own country to count in your own GDP. Now for fun, here's a quick map that shows you the different countries in the world based on their GDP. So you can tell some countries have huge GDPs and other ones don't. This helps you understand that there's a relationship between like institutions and economic systems. Countries that are capitalist have more GDP. Countries that have stable governments have more GDP than countries that don't. Although China right here has this really big GDP, they're actually the second largest GDP in the world, but there's a whole lot of people living in China and a whole lot of people in India. So this is the idea of what's called GDP per capita. It's the GDP divided by the population, and it's a good measure of standard of living. So to fully understand GDP, let's talk about what's not included in GDP. All right, first thing is intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are goods inside final goods that aren't counted. So the components inside this computer were sold to Apple, and Apple turned around and made a computer. The final computer counts towards GDP, but not all the pieces inside. So like the stock radio in a car doesn't count in GDP, but the car itself would count in GDP. And the reason why is you don't want to have double counting. Another thing that's not included is non-production transactions. You actually produce something. So financial transactions like stocks and bonds, you buy a certain number of stocks, that doesn't count in GDP because nothing was created. Same thing for real estate. If you buy a home, not this year, but like an old home, like a used good, that doesn't count towards GDP because again, nothing was produced. Just the things produced in that year. Also, last thing is illegal goods or non-market transactions. Things that are made in your house. So if you spend all this time and energy making an apple pie, right? The apples you bought count towards GDP, but all the time and energy and the service you provide to your family by making it and handing it out at the table, that doesn't count towards GDP. And neither do illegal things like drugs. They don't count towards GDP because we don't know exactly how much production of drugs happening in the country. Now, there's 2 ways to calculate GDP. There's the expenditures approach and the income approach. The expenditures approach is adding up all the spending on final goods inside the country. Now, it gives you the most important equation in this course. Now, pay attention. The most important equation in the entire course, not just the unit, the entire course. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, what does that mean? There's 4 entities that can buy stuff in the economy, right? There's consumers, businesses, governments, and other countries. So consumers is C. Consumer spending, if you're adding up all the spending in the country, is C. C is about 70% in the U.S. economy is consumer spending. Now, I is investment spending, which is, remember, business spending. They're buying machines and tools and factories and laptops. G is government spending on stuff. And then X minus M. X is exports, M is imports. So X minus M. Now, in the United States, that's called net exports. Net exports is negative. In other words, we're importing more than we export. The second way to calculate GDP is called the income approach. The income approach calculates all the income, the national income from all the spending. Now, it should be the same, right? If I spend money on your product and you get a certain number of income, that's just the same dollar amount, except it's a different equation. National income is rent plus wages plus interest plus profit. Now, those are called the factor payments. You learned that back in Unit 1. If you add up all different payments for the land, the labor, the interest, and the entrepreneurship, then you end up with the income approach. Remember, GDP is measured in dollars and cents, and there's a problem with that because prices change over time, and so we have to make some adjustments. Nominal GDP is the GDP not adjusted for inflation. It's in current dollars. Real GDP is GDP adjusted for inflation. So when we're looking at growth and probably everything else I'm going to do in this entire course, when I talk about GDP, if I say that, I'm talking about real GDP adjusted for inflation. Real GDP doesn't just stay the same, it changes over time. That's something called the business cycle. The business cycle has time and it has the real GDP, and as you can see over time, it kind of goes up and it goes down over time. Yeah, but it has 4 phases of this business cycle. There's a peak when it's up at its highest, there's a trough when it's at its lowest, right? And there's this period when the economy is going down, that's called a recession. Recession is technically when there's 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which means the economy is just going bad and it's going down and we're producing less stuff for 6 months. Now, the economy goes down, it's called a recession, then eventually hits the trough, then eventually there's an expansion, or also called a recovery. 4 phases: peak, recession, trough, recovery. Eventually you'll get a trend line that kind of shows you where we're going with the economy, and that's the idea of full employment. The economy is like over the full employment, there's actually a lot of inflation. You'll find out why in this unit, but when the economy is overheating, that's going to put pressure on prices, and it's going to lead to what's called an inflationary gap. Now, when the economy is doing poorly and there's going to be high unemployment, that leads to a recessionary gap. Now, the reason why that matters is because the economy could be like really crappy, but technically not still in a recession. So you're out of a recession, but there's still high employment. The economy's not doing well. That's called a recessionary gap. Let's talk about unemployment. Some people think that unemployment is just people who are not working, but it's a little more detailed than that. These are workers who are actively looking for a job who can't find one, right? And the unemployment rate is the percent of those workers in the labor force looking for a job, can't get one. Now, I say labor force because it's not the general population. Kids don't count in the labor force. People in jail don't count in the labor force. So we're talking about the labor force is a smaller group than the population. Above 16 years old, able and willing to work, not institutionalized in jail, and these are people who are not in the military. We're talking about the civilian labor force. So if you're a full-time student and you're not working and actively looking for a job, then you're not considered unemployed because you're not part of the labor force. Now, the unemployment rate is that equation, the number of people unemployed divided by the number of people in the labor force times 100, it gives you a percentage. And that comes out the first Friday of every month inside the United States. It tells you how the unemployment rate is. There's actually 3 different types of unemployment. There's frictional, cyclical, and structural. Let's go over each one of them. Frictional unemployment is the idea of being in between jobs. So when you graduate from college or from high school, you're looking for a job, you are frictionally unemployed, right? You're between work. You have skills, people want to hire you, it just takes time to go and get that job. The second type of unemployment is called structural unemployment. And the reason you lost your job is because your skills are obsolete. This is the idea of a VCR repairman, right? People don't want to hire you. You do not have transferable skills, and those jobs will just disappear. Like a lumberjack, right? You got replaced. So a part of that is something called technological unemployment. So if car manufacturers are replaced by robots, they're structurally unemployed. The third type of unemployment is called cyclical unemployment based on the business cycle. It's because the economy is doing poorly because there's a recessionary gap. So this is the idea that there's unemployment causes recession, and it feeds on itself. So let's say I'm thinking there's going to be a recession and I hire fewer workers. Those workers don't have income, so they stop buying stuff, and so those people lose their job. That's the idea of cyclical unemployment. Frictional and structural unemployment are going to happen in the economy. So that's the idea of what's called the natural rate of unemployment. When there's no cyclical unemployment, we have what's called full employment. So the natural rate is frictional plus structural unemployment, and it's the amount of unemployment that exists when the economy is doing healthy and it's doing good. So that being said, keep in mind, full employment is not the idea of zero unemployment. We're never going to get all of our workers who want a job working because there's always going to be frictional and structural unemployment. Now, in the United States, the natural rate of unemployment, or when the economy is at full employment, is around 4 to 6% unemployment. A better way to understand all these concepts is by looking at the production possibilities curve that you learned back in Unit 1. Over here on the left-hand side, we have the production possibilities curve. On the right-hand side, we have something new that you just learned, the business cycle. Take a look at the red curve. This red curve on the production possibilities curve represents full employment, right? We have 4 to 6% unemployment, and the economy is doing great. The second line represents something we can't even have, like maximum capacity with 0% unemployment. Every single person who wants a job is working. Now, any point inside the curve represents the idea of unemployment, right? A recessionary gap. The economy is not doing well. We're not using our full resources, right? That's the idea of a recession. A point on the curve is the idea of full employment, right? In the last unit, we talked about efficiency. We're using all of our resources. And a point outside the red curve leads to more inflation. Why? Well, if everyone has a job, if everybody's working and all resources are being used, if I want people to work for me and I want to use resources like lumber, I got to bid up the price. So I got to buy the lumber off you, but you're using a whole lot of lumber, but I need them for building houses and you need them for building houses. I'm going to bid up the price, and that's going to lead to more inflation and an inflationary gap. We're going to do this a whole lot in the next unit as well. We'll see the idea that the economy can be in 3 places. It can have a recessionary gap at full employment, or it can have an inflationary gap. Now, if you're not watching this video just to cram for a test, I suggest you watch 2 different videos. They're really good, right? They're my series called Econmovies. I did one using Back to the Future, and I did one using cars. It really jumps into the details of GDP and unemployment. You should definitely take a look at them. Education research says you should take a break every once in a while so your brain doesn't like turn to mush. So, for a bonus round, here are my 2 sons, David and James, playing in the front yard. Now let's recap. There's 3 goals of every economy: to grow over time, right? To keep unemployment down, but not zero. And last one, to keep prices stable. So let's talk about that last goal: keeping prices down. Inflation is the idea that prices rise over time. And you know the idea, right? Your grandpa says, oh, when I was a kid, movies were only 10 cents. Okay, thanks, Grandpa. So some examples here. It takes $2 to buy what $1 bought in 1987. It takes $6 to buy what $1 bought in 1970s, and $24 to buy what $1 bought in 1913. So you can see the prices have changed over time. That's the idea of inflation. Now, when inflation occurs, each dollar of income buys fewer goods and services. So is inflation good or bad? Well, it kind of depends on who you are, but for the most part, inflation is kind of bad. One of the main reasons is because if there's high inflation, that means banks are going to loan out less because they have to charge higher interest rates, and that's going to lead to less investment and less growth over time. So we don't want to have crazy inflation, especially unanticipated inflation. Now, there's also something called deflation. Deflation is when prices decrease over time, and it's also bad. If prices are falling, people hold back their purchases. So if prices are going down, and I think refrigerator is going to be cheaper next week, maybe I'll hold off on buying a refrigerator today, and the guys who made the refrigerator can't work anymore because they're not selling enough stuff. That leads to a recession. That's not good. There's also something called disinflation. Now, this is when there's still inflation, but inflation's going up at a slower rate. So if inflation's going up fast and all of a sudden now it starts slowing down, that's called disinflation. Inflation hurts some people and helps some people. Let's fill out this chart. People who are hurt by inflation is lenders. When I lend money to you and prices go up, there's unanticipated inflation, prices go up. Now I actually get paid back in less dollars than I loaned you, and that's a bad thing for a lender. Also, people with fixed income. So somebody who only makes $2,000 a month, that's a bad thing if prices start going up a whole lot. And last one, savers. If you save your money at home underneath your mattress, when prices go up, now that money actually has less purchasing power. Now, on the other side, people who are helped, borrowers. If you borrow money and then there's inflation, you pay that money back, that's a good thing for you. It might also be maybe a business where the price of the product goes up faster than the price of resources. That could help them in the short run. There's something called nominal wages and real wages. It's like nominal and real GDP. Nominal wages is your wage not adjusted for inflation. And then there's also real wage, which is your wage adjusted for inflation. One of the reasons you're in economics, right, is to learn concepts that are going to help you in life. If there's high inflation, now you understand you got to go to your boss and you say, listen, I need a raise. Not just because, you want a raise, you need a raise. If prices go up 10% and my wage stays exactly the same, I lost 10% of my income, my purchasing power. So I got to go into my boss and say, listen, prices went up 10%, I need a 10% raise, right? That's the idea of real and nominal wages. Let's talk about how inflation is measured. The government tracks prices over time, something called a market basket. They look at how do prices change for this market basket over time. And there's two different ways of looking at how prices have changed. One's called the inflation rate, the other one's called a price index. Now, the inflation rate tells you how prices changed since last year. So if the inflation rate is 5%, prices changed since last year 5%. Now, a price index shows you how prices have changed relative to some base year. So for a few examples here, the U.S. inflation rate in 2014 was 0.8%, but the consumer price index, which I'll talk about in a second for 2014, was 235 based on 1982 prices. Now, that index number of 235 means something if you understand it. It means prices have increased 135% since the base year. The most commonly used measure of consumer prices is the consumer price index. Now, here's how it works. The base year is given a number of 100, and then every number after it or before it is given also an index number. Now, there's an equation. Here's the equation. CPI equals the value of the market basket in the year you're looking for divided by the value of that same market basket in the base year times 100. Now, it pops out a number. That number gives you information. Here's an example. In 1997, the market basket for a movie was $6 and pizza was $14. So there's only two things in the market basket for a grand total of $20. So if you divide 20 divided by 20 times 100, it pops out 100. That 100 is the index number of the base year. Remember, the base year always has 100. Now, in 2009, the market basket is $8 for the movie and then $17 for the pizza for a grand total of $25. The question is, what's the CPI of 2009 based on 1997 base year prices? Well, it's $25 divided by 20 times 100 pops out 125. Now, 125 means something. It means prices have increased 25%. Not 125%, but just 25%. So when you see a CPI of 150, it means prices increased 50% since the base year. If you see one of 200, it means prices increased 100% since the base year. If you see one for 90, then that means that prices decreased 10% since the base year. Hopefully you've been filling out the ultimate review packet. I've been talking about these concepts. What I need you to do right now is pause and go fill out the part that's talking about CPI. I want you to practice that equation, practice that concept of calculating the consumer price index. A couple of problems with the CPI. First is the substitution bias. When prices go up, it looks like, oh no, there's inflation, but the reality is when prices go up, some people stop buying certain products. So the market basket says, oh, prices went up for these things, but some people didn't buy those things. So the actual inflation that's reported is not actually affecting people as much as it says it is. Another issue might be the idea of new products. Right? When a new product comes out, like when the iPad first came out, if the prices are going up for it, we have no reference point because it's brand new. It's not in some old market basket. The last problem is the idea of product quality. I mean, your computer is way better than the computer that I had when I was in college, right? And the idea is that prices might go up, but quality might actually be way better. So the idea of CPI doesn't exactly capture that there's better quality in products. In addition to the CPI, there's also something called the GDP deflator. The CPI looks at consumer goods, but the GDP deflator looks at all goods inside the economy, looking at things that businesses buy and that the government buys. So the GDP deflator measures the price of all goods, whereas CPI measures only the goods and services bought by consumers. There's an equation. It's right here. The GDP deflator equals the nominal GDP for a country divided by the real GDP times 100. It pops out a number that's almost exactly like the CPI. It's an index number. So 120 means prices increased 20% since the base year. Now, there's a bunch of questions on the ultimate review packet, but let's do two questions right here to make sure you're actually getting it and you can use the equation. In an economy, the real GDP for the base year 1996 is 125 billion and the nominal GDP is 150 billion. Calculate the GDP deflator. So you can just throw it in the equation. You got 150 divided by 125 times 100. It pops out 120. That means prices increased 20% since the base year. Remember, it's not a percentage. It's an index number, just like the CPI. So 120 means prices went went up 20%, which it did, right? From 125 up to 150, that's an increase of 20%. Now, the second question, in an economy, the real GDP for base year is 200 billion and the real GDP deflator is 120. Calculate the nominal GDP. So now you have to adjust the equation around a little bit, but you have to now solve for the nominal GDP. But you understand the idea, right? The real GDP adjusted for inflation is 200. Prices have gone up what percent, right? The GDP deflator is 120, prices went up 20%. So the question is really saying, what is real GDP of 200 when prices went up 20% of it? Well, 20% of 200 is 40, and so the nominal GDP must be 240. Now, I just did that in my head, but you could just use the equation, right? It's right here, GDP deflator of 120, and then X divided by 200 times 100, that gives you the right answer. The last thing we're going to do is talk about the 3 causes of inflation, something called the quantity theory of money. All right, 3 reasons why prices go up. The first one is the government just prints money. This happens in multiple different countries. This is when the government keeps printing money to pay off its debts, and it leads to something called hyperinflation. You learned about it in your history class when it talked about, the German government after World War I. Now, that's going to lead us to this idea of what's called the quantity theory of money. I'll get to the second 2 causes of inflation in a second, but the real GDP in a year is 400 billion, but the amount of money in the economy is only 100 billion. How are we paying for things, right? So I'm introducing this idea of the quantity theory of money. If GDP, the nominal GDP is 400 billion, and we only have $100 out there, how are we paying for things? Well, we're paying for things with that same money, right? I spend it, and then you turn around and you spend it, and you turn around and spend it. So the number of times that money gets spent and respent is called the velocity of money, right? So that being said, how much is the velocity of money in this example? Well, it's 4. Right? If we have $100 and there's 400 total dollars of spending being done, the velocity of money is 4. This leads us to the quantity theory of money. It's an equation, it's actually called an identity that shows the idea and the relationship between these 4 different things. It's M times V equals P times Y. M is the amount of money supply that's in the economy, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, the general level of prices, and Y is the real GDP, the number of stuff we're actually producing. Now I want you to notice, P times Y is the nominal GDP, right? It's the GDP not adjusted for inflation. The price, the current dollar price of all the stuff we're producing. And it equals the amount of money we have times how much that money is actually spent and respent. Now the reason why this is important is because it explains why printing money causes inflation. Let's assume that the velocity of money doesn't change much. People, their spending habits don't really change much in the short run. They'll buy the same amount as they normally do. Let's also assume that Y doesn't change when we increase the amount of money supply, because it doesn't. You have a certain number of factories and tools you can produce stuff. Putting more money in the system doesn't automatically make more tools. Now, the point is that if you increase the M, the money supply, and V and Y stay the same, what's going to happen? Well, the prices are just going to go up. Now, there's 2 more causes. The next one is called demand pull inflation. This is when people want to buy more stuff. It's not that we're printing more money. It's just people want to buy things. If you want to buy it, and I want to buy it, and he wants to buy it, we're all going to bid up the price. And that's called demand pull inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. And it's basically an overheated economy. This is the idea that would lead to an inflationary gap, right? Cost push inflation is the last one. This is happening because there's a negative supply shock or something's happening that's causing the production cost to increase. It's not that people want to buy stuff, it's that we can't produce as much stuff. So when we just run out of oil or gasoline or other key resource like electricity, that's called a negative supply shock. The cost of everything is going to start going up because we're producing less of it and people are still trying to buy it, bidding up the prices, but it's because supply decreased. So to explain it better, demand pull inflation is when demand goes up for stuff, and then cost push inflation happens because supply decreases, causing the price to go higher. Now, I know I'm going really fast, but keep in mind, I made a boatload of other videos that explain all these concepts. So click right here to watch the unit playlist. I'll go through each one of these. I'll give you more examples and more practice, and it'll help you understand the concept. Make sure you fill out the packet. If you fill out the packet, you understand the concept, you know you're getting it. If you're filling out the packet, like, I don't know this, I don't get this, I can't do that question, it means you gotta go back, watch one of these videos and practice. The last thing you need to do is go to the multiple choice practice questions inside this unit. I have several different questions. Go ahead and click right here. It'll take you to those questions. Then you can practice, make sure you're actually getting it so you're ready for the test. As always, I want to thank you for watching my YouTube channel and supporting ACDCEcon by getting the packet. Thank you so much. Until next time.